It is 1948. She buys the wooden spoon at a 5 and dime for 11 cents. She doesn't know yet she'll use it every day for the rest of her life. By 1963, the handle has a groove where her thumb always rests. By 1971, the bowl has gone dark with decades of broth and slow stirring. She doesn't replace it. Nothing is wrong with it. You smell it before you see it. The screen door slaps. Something low and slow hits you in the chest. She's standing there with that spoon. She doesn't look up. She doesn't have to. Number 25. Potato peel soup. The potatoes went into supper. The peels, long, curling, smelling of dark earth, went into a separate bowl. Next morning, those peels went into water with onion and fat and became something else entirely. In Appalachian Kentucky and Pennsylvania's immigrant neighborhoods. You didn't make this because you were clever. You made it because throwing the peels away felt like an insult. The peel holds more potassium, more iron, more fiber than the flesh inside. Nutritionists spent decades figuring that out. She already knew. She knew because she could feel the difference between a meal that stuck and one that didn't. This was not poverty on a plate. This was the whole potato, honored completely. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 24. Bean and ham hock soup. A ham hock in 1962 cost 10 to 15 cents a pound in the Deep South and the Ozark Mountains. Not the desirable part. The part left when everything else was taken. Mostly bone, some fat. A little meat if you were patient. She was patient. Dried pinto beans, 8 cents a pound. Cold water. She left it overnight. By afternoon the broth was dark amber, and the whole kitchen smelled like Sunday, even though it was Tuesday. Grandma just called it ham and beans. Fed a family of 6 for 2 days on 40 cents. Today, gastropubs charge $14 a bowl and call the hock slow-braised heritage pork. Same beans, same hock. They're charging for the patience. They know you've forgotten how to have it. Number 23. Tomato milk soup. 2 things. A can of whole tomatoes, 10 cents in 1963, and whole milk, less than a dime a quart. You heated them separately. Combined them slowly, carefully, because rushing curdled the milk, and then you had something less. Salt. A pinch of sugar. Butter if you had it. 4 bowls. Under 20 cents. Across Wisconsin and Iowa and New England farmhouses, this was the noon meal in winter. Not elegant. Not meant to be. The fat from the milk and the acid from the tomatoes did something together. That was more than either part alone. Today we call it tomato bisque. $9 a cup. Blended smooth, served in white ceramic. The original was rougher. More honest. Nothing has been improved. Number 22. Rivel soup, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. German farming communities, roots going back to the 1700s. 3 ingredients: flour, an egg, chicken broth. You rubbed them together with your fingers until small, rough clumps formed, rivels. Dropped into boiling broth, they cooked in 3 minutes and became something soft, yielding, deeply satisfying. Under 15 cents. Total, Grandma just called it Rivel soup. It didn't need another name. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. That exact soup now appears in kitchen boutiques as artisan German-style dumpling broth. Williams-Sonoma sold a kit for $22. It contained flour, an instruction card, a suggestion to pair it with Riesling. She would have had something to say about that. She was too polite. But she would have had something to say. Number 21. Cabbage and tomato soup. A head of cabbage in 1962 cost 5 cents, sometimes less. In the Polish, Czech, and Slovak neighborhoods of Chicago's South Side, of Pittsburgh's Strip District, of Cleveland's Slavic Village. Cabbage was not a vegetable you bought when you were feeling ambitious. It was what you bought when you needed to feed people, and you were being careful with what you had. You shredded it. You sweated it in a little lard or bacon fat until the edges went translucent and a little brown. You added canned tomatoes, a bay leaf, maybe a carrot, water. You let it cook until the cabbage gave up its structure and became something soft and sweet and slightly sour all at once, something that the broth had absorbed completely into itself. Scientists at the USDA have since documented what those women knew intuitively. Cabbage is one of the most nutrient-dense vegetables ever measured per penny spent. Vitamin C, vitamin K folate, sulforaphane, a compound now linked to cancer-fighting properties in multiple clinical studies. For 5 cents a head, she was doing things with chemistry that researchers are still trying to understand. She knew none of those words. She didn't need them. Number 20. Oxtail soup, 8 cents a pound, sometimes 10. In the 1950s and into the 1960s, oxtails sat in the butcher case in the black neighborhoods of Chicago's South Side, of Detroit's Paradise Valley, of Baltimore's Penn North, because almost nobody else wanted them. Too bony, too much work. Not enough meat per pound if you were measuring meat the way most people measured it, by what you could cut off and eat directly. She was not measuring it that way. She browned those tails in a heavy pot until the kitchen smelled like something ancient and good, added onion and celery and tomato and water, and left it on the lowest flame for 4 hours. What came out was not a broth. It was a liquid that had taken on the character of the collagen in those bones, dark, thick at the edges of the bowl, unctuous in the mouth, with meat that fell from the bone at a touch. That is not an accident. That is chemistry. Collagen from bone and connective tissue converts to gelatin during long, slow cooking. It is the same compound that now appears in $40 jars at Whole Foods labeled bone broth collagen support. Oxtail now costs $8 to $12 a pound at specialty butchers. The soup has not changed, only who decided it was worth something. Number 19. Navy bean soup, 12 cents a pound for navy beans in 1963. Small, white, almost perfectly round. They had no flavor on their own. That was the point. They were a vessel. You gave them time and heat and liquid and aromatics, and they became a carrier for everything around them, absorbing the smoke from a ham bone, the sweetness from a carrot, the sharpness from a bay leaf, until the broth and the bean were one thing, and neither made sense without the other. A single pot fed 8 people. The total cost sat under 50 cents. The United States Senate has served navy bean soup in its dining room every single day since 1903. Every single day. 120 years of the same soup. There is a reason for that. Not nostalgia, utility. It keeps a person full. It delivers protein and fiber and complex carbohydrates in a form the body processes slowly and evenly. It is, in nutritional terms, nearly a complete meal in a bowl. She didn't know about the Senate. She didn't need to. She knew the bowl kept her children from being hungry until the next meal, and in the 1960s in rural New England and across the Midwest farm belt, that was the only measurement that mattered. Number 18. Chicken foot soup, 2 cents a pound. Sometimes the butcher gave them away. Chicken feet, yellow-skinned, clawed, strange-looking things that nobody in the growing American middle class of the 1960s wanted on their counter. The civil rights generation growing up in the Black South, Puerto Rican families newly arrived in East Harlem and the South Bronx, Appalachian households that had been stretching every animal as far as it would go for generations. They knew what those feet held. You cleaned them. You scalded them. You put them in cold water with onion and celery and black pepper, and you brought them slowly to a simmer, and you left them for 3 hours. The broth that resulted was the color of pale gold, and it had a quality to it, a body, a silkiness, a thickness at the lip of the bowl, that no broth made from breast meat or back meat ever matched. That quality is collagen. Chicken feet are almost entirely collagen and connective tissue. The bone broth industry in America now generates over $2 billion a year, selling exactly what those feet produced. The jars at the health food store cost $8 to $12 each, and they are labeled with words like gut health and joint support and ancient wisdom. That is not ancient wisdom. That is Tuesday in a kitchen in 1962. She was there first. She is not being credited. Number 17. Cornmeal soup. A pound of cornmeal cost 5 cents in rural Virginia and North Carolina in the early 1960s. 5 cents. She made mush from it most mornings, a thick porridge that filled the children before school. But when the money was short and the pot needed to go further, she thinned the mush down with water or broth until it was a soup, barely thickened, golden-colored, with a faint sweetness and a graininess that settled heavy in the stomach and stayed there. It sounds like almost nothing. It was almost nothing, ingredient-wise. But the texture of it, the way the cornmeal suspended in the liquid and settled on the tongue, was particular. You could not replicate it with anything else. She added salt and a little fat, sometimes a scrap of pork if there was one, sometimes just salt, and it was enough. Today we call it polenta broth and charge $16 a bowl in the kind of restaurant where the server explains what polenta is. Grandma just called it cornmeal soup and didn't feel the need to explain anything to anyone. She knew what she had. She always knew what she had. Number 16. Split pea soup. Split peas were 15 cents a pound in New England and in the Dutch immigrant communities of western Michigan in the 1960s. Green or yellow, it didn't matter. Both cooked down to the same thick, almost grainy consistency, the same muted earthen color, the same deeply filling density that made it one of the most reliable soups in the American kitchen for most of the 20th century. She put them in with a ham bone or a smoked ham hock, an onion, a carrot, water. She did not need to do much else. The peas did the work. They dissolved as they cooked, releasing their starch into the broth until the liquid and the solid were indistinguishable, until what you had in the pot was less a soup and more a statement about what patience produces. A family of 5 ate for 30 cents. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Split peas are one of the highest protein per penny foods ever documented. Per 100 calories, dried split peas deliver more protein than chicken breast. They carry folate, iron, potassium. A pound of split peas has fed more children through more American winters than any supplement, any protein shake, any fortified breakfast cereal that food companies spent the 1960s convincing mothers they needed instead. That is not progress. That is a substitution, one that cost more and delivered less. Something happened between 1962 and 1968. It did not happen by accident. In 1962, Campbell Soup Company launched a coordinated national advertising campaign. Not a subtle one, not one that hid its intent. The campaign targeted American housewives directly and explicitly with a single message. Modern mothers do not stand over a soup pot. Modern mothers open a can. The ads ran in women's magazines, on daytime television, in newspapers in every major market in the country. They used the word modern the way a weapon uses an edge, quietly, effectively, against something that didn't know it was being attacked. The soups in this video were the thing being attacked. By 1965, Campbell's controlled more than 80% of the canned soup market in the United States. The home soup-making tradition that had sustained American families through the Depression, through the war, through the entire first half of the 20th century was being reclassified. Not through force, not through law, but through shame. Through the suggestion, repeated in enough magazines and enough television commercials and enough conversations at enough grocery stores, that a woman who still made soup from scratch was behind, was not keeping up, was failing her family by spending 4 hours on something that could be accomplished in 4 minutes. What they did not say, what they knew and did not say, was this: home-cooked soups retain between 40 and 60% more micronutrients than commercially canned equivalents. The canning process requires high-temperature processing that degrades B vitamins, folate, and heat-sensitive minerals. The USDA's own nutrition data, compiled through the late 1960s and 1970s, documented this. The data existed. It was not hidden. It was simply not the data that anyone with a financial interest in canned soup was going to put in a television commercial. She knew something was being taken from her. She kept making the soup anyway for a while. And then she got older, and the daughters had grown up with the television, and the cans were right there on the shelf, and the knowledge moved one generation further away from the hands that held it. They knew things about broth and bone and time that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Number 15. Sorrel soup. On the Lower East Side of Manhattan, in Brooklyn's Brownsville neighborhood, in the Bronx apartments where Jewish immigrant families had put down roots after arriving from Poland and Russia and Ukraine. In the early part of the century, there was a soup called shav. You pronounced it like shav. You made it from sorrel, a green, leafy plant with a sharp, lemony sourness that hit the back of the throat the way no other vegetable did. You cooked it down in water with a little onion, added sour cream, sometimes a hard-boiled egg, and served it cold in summer or warm in the colder months. Sorrel grew in vacant lots. It grew along fence lines. In the old country, you pulled it from the ground in spring, and it meant that winter was over. In Brooklyn in the 1950s and early 1960s, it cost almost nothing at the greengrocer. The whole soup came in under 25 cents. That soup is almost entirely gone now. The grandmothers who made it are gone. Their daughters mostly didn't learn it. Their granddaughters have never tasted it. Shav appears occasionally at old-school Jewish delights in New York. Fewer every year. And when younger people encounter it, they don't know what to make of it. The sourness surprises them. They've been trained to expect sweetness. That is not a coincidence. Number 14. Butter bean soup in Georgia and Alabama and the rural Carolinas, in the kitchens of black and white families alike, who were working the same worn-out land and stretching the same tight dollars, butter beans were not a side dish. Dried butter beans, large, flat, pale green, cost 10 cents a pound in 1963. You soaked them overnight. You cooked them the next day with a ham bone or a piece of fatback and a diced onion and whatever else was there, and by dinner they had become something creamy and dense, the broth thick with starch and fat, and the slow flavor of pork. It was a full meal. It looked like soup. It was dinner. The children didn't ask what else was coming. They knew there was nothing else coming, and they weren't sorry about it, because what was in the bowl was rich enough and filling enough that nothing else was needed. A pound of dried butter beans fed a family of 5. The total cost, including the fatback, sat under 30 cents. She served it with cornbread she made in a cast-iron skillet that had been seasoned black over 30 years. The skillet outlasted everything. It is probably still somewhere. Someone should be using it. Number 13. Wild green soup. She went outside and picked it. That was the price. 0. The labor was hers. In the Appalachian Hill Country of Virginia and West Virginia, in the Ozark communities of Missouri and Arkansas, in the rural South, where the knowledge of what was edible in the natural landscape had been passed down through generations of necessity and intimacy with the land. The early spring was a pantry. Poke salad, young poke shoots before the plant became toxic, picked small and cooked long. Dandelion greens, bitter and bright. Lamb's quarter, which tasted like a softer, less assertive spinach and grew in disturbed soil everywhere it was allowed to. She picked what was available. She washed it. She put it in water with whatever fat she had and a little salt, and she cooked it down until the greens went dark and silky, and the broth turned green-brown and deeply, minerally rich. She ladled it into bowls with cornbread on the side. Something happened to those plants in the mid-1960s. The herbicide industry, Dow Chemical, Monsanto, the agricultural chemical companies that were selling modernity to American farmers, the same way Campbell's was selling it to American mothers, had been developing and distributing broadleaf herbicides since the late 1950s. By 1965, those chemicals were in widespread use on American farmland, on roadsides, on the vacant lots, where poke and dandelion and lamb's quarter had grown freely for generations. They called the plants weeds. They had always been food. That is not progress. That is the profitable reclassification of a free resource as a problem requiring a paid solution. Number 12. Bread soup. The bread was going stale. That was the starting point. In the Italian immigrant households of South Philadelphia, of Brooklyn's Carroll Gardens, of Newark's iron-bound neighborhood, bread that had gone hard was not bread that was finished. It was bread that was ready to become something else. You tore it into pieces. You put it in a pot with olive oil and garlic and water or chicken broth. You cooked it until the bread had absorbed everything and collapsed into the liquid. And what you had was thick, almost porridge-like, something between a soup and a stew. A pot cost under 10 cents. Less if the bread was already on hand. Grandma just called it bread soup. In Tuscany they call it ribollita. In Rome, papa al pomodoro. In the Italian restaurants of New York and San Francisco and Chicago that opened in the 1990s and 2000s, when food writers discovered that peasant cooking was actually interesting, it appeared on menus for $18 to $22 a bowl, with a drizzle of estate-grown olive oil and a sprig of something decorative. She would not have recognized the presentation. She would have recognized the soup immediately. It was hers. It had always been hers. Number 11. Milk and potato soup, 4 potatoes, a quart of milk, salt, pepper, a little butter if there was butter. Under 25 cents in the rural Midwest and on the Great Plains in the early 1960s, in the Irish immigrant communities of Chicago's Bridgeport neighborhood and Boston's Dorchester, in farmhouses where the milk came from the family's own cow and the potatoes came from the root cellar. You diced the potatoes small. You cooked them in salted water until just tender. You added the milk, whole milk, warm, not cold, and let everything heat together slowly until the potato starch had begun to thicken the milk and the two had become inseparable. Butter at the end, a handful of chives if you had them, more often just the soup. Irish immigrants who had survived the famine on something not far from this called it poor man's chowder, without irony and without shame. They knew exactly what it was, and they also knew that it was warm and it was filling, and it asked almost nothing of them to make. The simplicity was the point. The simplicity was not a limitation, it was a form of intelligence. They knew things about feeding a family under pressure that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Number 10. Giblet soup. When you bought a chicken in the 1960s, a whole chicken, 2 pounds for under $1 at the grocery, there was a small paper package tucked inside the cavity, the giblets. Liver, heart, gizzard, neck, free, included. An afterthought on the part of whoever packaged the bird, but not an afterthought in the kitchen. She took that package out and set it aside. She used the rest of the chicken for whatever the chicken was for. Then she put the neck and the gizzard into a pot of cold water, with an onion she'd halved without peeling, a stalk of celery, a few peppercorns. She brought it slowly to a simmer, skimmed the gray foam off the surface as it rose, and left it for 2 hours. The broth that resulted was something deeper than regular chicken stock. The gizzard added a mineral quality, an earthiness. The neck gave body. She added noodles or rice, diced the liver and heart, and added those too in the last few minutes, so they didn't overcook and harden. Grandma just called it using the whole bird. Today that broth, made from organ meat and bones that butchers still primarily discard, is being repackaged as heritage poultry bone broth and sold for $9 a quart at grocery stores that opened after 1995. Nothing new has been added to it. The discovery is only new to the people doing the discovering. Number 9. Sauerkraut soup. In the German and Eastern European communities of Wisconsin's Fox River Valley, of Ohio's Mayoning Valley, of the Minnesota Iron Range, where immigrants from Germany and Poland and Czechoslovakia had come to work the mines and the mills, and had brought their food with them across the Atlantic, sauerkraut was not a condiment. It was a preservation system. A quart jar of homemade sauerkraut, cabbage, salt, thyme, cost almost nothing and lasted through winter. She put a cup of it in a pot with pork, a smoked sausage, a pork bone, whatever she had, added water and potatoes and maybe a carrot, and let it cook until everything was soft. And the broth had taken on the sourness of the fermented cabbage and the smoke of the pork and the sweetness of the potato all at once. The whole pot cost under 30 cents. Researchers studying the human gut microbiome have spent the past 2 decades building the scientific case for what she already knew from feel. Fermented foods support the colonies of beneficial bacteria in the digestive system in ways that nothing manufactured in a laboratory can fully replicate. The word probiotic did not exist in her vocabulary. She didn't know about lactobacillus, or gut flora, or the gut-brain axis. She knew that people who ate this soup got sick less in winter. She knew the soup was good for you in a way she felt but could not articulate. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 8. Black-eyed pea soup. In Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and the stretches of East Texas, where the soil was sandy and the pay was low, and the federal programs hadn't reached yet, black-eyed peas were not a New Year's tradition. They were Tuesday. They were any day when the money was short and 6 people needed to eat. 10 cents a pound in 1963 for dried black-eyed peas. A full pot, enough for a family of 6 with some left for the next morning. Cost under 35 cents, including the smoked pork she added for depth. She soaked them overnight, cooked them the next day with onion and garlic, and a piece of salt pork, or a smoked ham hock, seasoned them with pepper and whatever she had that was green, let them cook until the peas were soft, and some of them had broken down into the broth and thickened it. The broth was dark and rich and slightly sweet from the peas. You ate it with hot water cornbread if you had the cornmeal, or just by itself if you didn't. She didn't make it on New Year's for luck. She made it because it was food, and her family was hungry. The luck was that the peas cost 10 cents a pound. The luck was knowing what to do with them. Both of those things are rarer now than they used to be. Number 7. Watercress soup. She walked to the creek barefoot in the early morning before the day got hot, and she pulled the watercress from the cold, shallow water with her hands. It grew everywhere along the clean-running creeks of the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia and West Virginia. Bright green, peppery, dense with small leaves that looked almost too delicate to cook and weren't. She brought it home in an apron or a bucket, and it was still cold and wet when she put it in the pot. You wilted it in butter or lard with a little garlic. You added broth, whatever broth was on hand, or just water and let it cook briefly. You did not want to overdo it. 5 minutes, maybe 10. Long enough for the watercress to go dark and soft and release its flavor into the liquid, short enough to keep some brightness in the broth. The CDC's Powerhouse Foods list, a ranking of fruits and vegetables by nutrient density per calorie, compiled by researchers at the Centers for Disease Control, ranks watercress number 1, first place, above spinach, above kale, above every other plant food they measured. She didn't need the CDC. She had the creek, and she had the knowledge of what the creek produced, and she trusted what she knew. That watercress soup cost her nothing but the walk. It fed her family better per penny than almost anything money could have bought. Number 6. Onion soup. Not the French version, not the restaurant version with the crocs and the Gruyere and the bread floating on top. That version existed in France and eventually in American imitation French restaurants, and it was its own thing. This is a different soup from a different tradition. A bag of yellow onions in 1963 cost a dime. She sliced them thin and put them in a heavy pot, a cast-iron Dutch oven if she had one, a heavy aluminum pot if she didn't, with a spoonful of lard, and cooked them over low heat until they turned from sharp and pungent to sweet and golden and almost jammy, until the sugars in the onion had begun to caramelize, and what was in the pot smelled nothing like what she'd started with. This took 45 minutes. She didn't rush it. She couldn't rush it. You cannot rush an onion, then water. Or beef broth if there was a bone. Salt and pepper. Bread if there was stale bread, crumbled directly into the bowl rather than floated on top. The whole pot cost under 20 cents. French onion soup at a restaurant now costs $12 to $16. The American poor man's version that predated it used the same core ingredient, the same technique, and asked nothing of you except the 45 minutes it took to let the onions become what they were going to become. That time was not a cost. That time was the recipe. There is a word for what happened to the American kitchen between 1955 and 1970. The word is displacement. It did not happen because home cooking failed. It happened because an industry decided that home cooking was competition and responded accordingly. In 1958, General Mills and Pillsbury, between them controlling a significant portion of the processed food market, began a coordinated lobbying effort at the USDA to revise federal nutritional guidelines in ways that favored processed grain products over whole foods. This is documented. It is in the public record of USDA Advisory Committee meetings from that period. The result was school lunch program, nutritional standards, that made it easier, cheaper, and administratively simpler for schools to serve processed foods than fresh ones. An entire generation of American children grew up in a school cafeteria system that had been shaped at the lobbying level by companies with a financial interest in what those children ate. Those children came home from school and watched television. The television showed them what food was supposed to look like, what it was supposed to come from. A box, a can, a package with a smiling woman on the front who had not stood over a pot for 4 hours because she had made something better. Something modern. A University of Minnesota nutrition study published in 1974 found that children raised primarily on home-cooked meals had measurably better micronutrient profiles, specifically higher iron, folate, and B vitamin levels, than children raised primarily on processed food equivalents. The data existed. The data was published. The companies that had spent a decade building the processed food infrastructure that the data indicted were by 1974 too large, too embedded in American life, too woven into grocery stores' shelves and school lunch programs and television schedules to be meaningfully challenged by a nutrition study. And the grandmothers were getting older. And the daughters had already half forgotten. And the granddaughters were being born into a world where soup came from a can, and the can was normal, and the pot on the back of the stove for 4 hours was the strange thing, the exceptional thing, the thing that required explanation. That is not progress. That is the successful execution of a business strategy against a food tradition that had no marketing budget and no lobbyist, and no one to speak for it except the women who lived it, and they were not being asked. Number 5. Peanut soup. George Washington Carver documented it in 1916 at the Tuskegee Institute. By that point, peanut soup had already been in continuous production in Virginia and North Carolina and Georgia for generations, in the plantation kitchens run by enslaved black women, in the rural farm kitchens after emancipation, in both black and white households throughout the South, where peanuts grew cheaply and in abundance. A pound of peanuts in the early 1960s cost under 10 cents. A full pot of peanut soup, rich, thick, slightly sweet, with a depth of flavor that surprised people who had never tasted it, cost under 30 cents. You made a peanut paste and added it to a broth with onion and celery, and whatever seasoning you had. The fat from the peanuts emulsified into the liquid. The protein from the peanuts thickened it. What you ended up with was something that had no equivalent in any other cuisine, something that tasted American in the deepest, oldest sense of that word, from the African knowledge that came with enslaved people, planted in Virginia soil, documented by a black scientist at a black institution, and eaten by poor people of every race across the South for 100 years. This is one of the oldest continuously made soups in American history. It appeared on the White House menu during colonial Virginia's influence on the early republic. It is almost entirely absent from the American table now. Not because it isn't good. It is extraordinary. Because extraordinary is not a protection against